and today I'm going to talk about Burton Ale, a type of beer which, for the first half of the 20th century, was extremely common and was on sale in pretty much every London pub as one of the standard draft beers, but which started going out of fashion after World War II, and now is so obscure there's only one example left, which is Young's Warmer, which doesn't even have the name Burton anymore because they changed it in the 1970s for some reason. Anyway, I'm going to have a look at the history of this style and what it was like. So when you go back to the 1830s, this is when the big London porter breweries started brewing ales, and they brewed two parallel sets of ales: X ales, which were the milds, and K ales, which were the stock ales. And these were two parallel sets. So you had 1X to 4X, and then 2K to 4K. The equivalent beers were the same strength, so a 2K was the same strength as a 2X, the difference being that it'd have about 50% more hops. And why did it have more hops? Well, because it was going to be capped before it was sold. So these beers would be matured probably for 9 to 12 months at least in the cask, so not in vats, before they were sold. So these would have some proper age on them. Originally, these were all pale beers. And then towards the end of the 19th century, the same way that mild ales start going darker, so do these K ales. And it's also in the last few decades of the 19th century when they start being called Burton or Burton ales, even though they weren't brewed in Burton, but were brewed in London, which is a little bit confusing. And it's also confusing because they're not at all connected to Burton Pale Ale, which is often what people think of when they hear the term Burton Ale. So these were fairly powerful beers. KK, which was the standard one in the last couple of decades of the 19th century and leading up to World War One, was about 1070 to 1075. So somewhere around 7.5% ABV. But there were still stronger versions, 3X, and that was over 1080. So that was like 8.5% ABV. And occasionally even something 4K, which would have been around 1100. Like with all other beer styles, the gravity's got knocked down by the two world wars. So after World War One, a typical London draft Burton would be about 1055, which is about the maximum strength you had generally for draft beers, tied into the last set of price controls after World War One. So these were basically 8D per pint beers, and they're normally about in the 1050s. You also have pale ales and stouts in this class. But you also had some stronger beers still being brewed, some ones of 1075 or even 1080, which were normally called 3K or 3X. And these were some of the strongest draft beers you would have had in between the wars. But these were only available generally during the winter months. So these were special beers like old ales you had when I was younger, where you'd have a little cask sat on the bar of something like Marston's Oud Roger. Um, After World War II, that was still fairly standard for the first few years. And then in the 50s, they seemed to start fading away. Whitbread, for example, didn't really have one in the 1950s, even though they're a big London brewery. But other ones continued with it. So you still had Young's and Fuller's brewing them. Truman still had ones. So there were still reasonably common beers. But they gradually sort of faded away until by the mid 1960s, I think really only Fuller's and Young's were still making them. But interestingly, Young's was still making something called 4X, which was in the high 1070s. So a really, really strong beer for the period. And it's surprising how long that one carried on. I mean, I think it's a shame that it's faded away as a type of beer. It made a pub more interesting, and when you got a stronger dark beer other than porter and stout, and when you had something that's about the strength of a strong bitter, but more like a mild in character. And getting on to what they were like, the original ones were all just straight pale malt. When you get to the end of the 19th century, they start throwing in some sugar and other stuff. Get through to the 1930s, and then often they were being party garled with mild ales. That's what happened at Fuller's and Young's. So then they'd have something like a mild grist. So they might have a base of mostly mild malt, crystal malt, number three invert sugar, things like that. But generally no malts darker than that. Just like milds, they were getting most of the colour from either number three invert, crystal malt, or from caramel. And that's pretty much what Young's Winter Warmer's like today. It's basically like a strong mild. And yeah, something I find interesting. And whenever I see it on draft, it's a beer that I try to drink. Well, okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that. And yeah, like I said, keep the suggestions coming in. This was sort of inspired by someone asking about stock ales. So any questions or any suggestions, just put them in the comments. Thank you and bye bye.